Guys, in this screencast, I want to go over the importance of proper code indentation and how to properly format our code within what we call code blocks. I want to draw some correlations to traditional literature and how we write English and draw some kind of correlations to why it's important for us to format our code properly, making it easier to read and understand and share with others. So I'm here within our project. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to go ahead and right-click the project and go New File. I'm going to call it literature.js. Now I have a little program here that's going to show every single keystroke I make. So as I'm doing this, feel free to follow along with my keystrokes and practice. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Create. Now I have my literature.js. I'm going to go ahead and open that by double-clicking it. And within it, let's take a look at how we would write normal English, right? So I copied some text here. It's called Lorem Ipsum. And the Lorem Ipsum is basically not English, but it looks like it's formatted like English. So we would normally write this text in what we call paragraphs, right? So we would have paragraphs of text, and they would look something like this. So we'd have 3 paragraphs here. And we're just naturally, we learned from an early age how to read this text and how to format it. We have sentences where we have periods at the end of sentences, and we put 2 spaces after those periods. We usually put a space between our paragraphs. In some cases, we would put 2 spaces between our paragraphs. So there are these kind of rules that we've established within writing our English that makes it easier for us to actually read the text. Same thing holds true when we're talking about code. Code can be written in a way where everything is kind of together, just as English could, right? We could technically put it like this. It wouldn't be correct, right? But it would still be readable text. It would be harder to read, but we wouldn't be able to kind of distinguish between paragraphs and things like that. So the same thing holds true with code. And usually there's usually this idea of a code block. And code blocks are usually wrapped in something. So unlike a paragraph where it's just kind of a blob of text, kind of grouped together, or I shouldn't say a blob of text, a series of sentences put together to form a paragraph, a code block is a series of pieces of code or lines of code within a section of your program. And there's various different ways in which we can define code blocks. And we've seen them in a couple of different ways in our class so far. The first was a function, right? So the first thing we want to do is write a function. So we would type function and setup, right? Because we want to do our setup function. We're going to open and close our parentheses, give it a space, and then open our curly brackets. And now stop right here. This is important. The curly bracket opening is the start of a new code block. So we're starting a new code block. Whenever we start a new code block, that means any code underneath it should be indented in place. So what I'm going to do here is hit enter. Now our editor will close the code block automatically and put our cursor right in that indentation point. If we went back here, we could technically write code, right? So if we wanted to create, a variable here, my variable, we could, and we could say equals 0, whatever. But this makes it a little harder to read. We could also do this, right? That will run, but it's much harder to read. So putting code, anytime we open a code block, putting your code indented here, using a tab. See how I'm using a tab here? So I'm going back and hitting tab. That will keep our code organized. Now, every single command in our code should be on a new line. So that kind of coincides with what happened here. I defined the function, and then I went to a new line within a new code block, which indented it, and now I have another line. So the next line of code I write shouldn't be right after this semicolon. It should be on a new line. Right? And a lot of times what I'd like to do is if there is another code block that we're setting up, say for example we want to do a conditional statement, I would even give it a little room. It's okay to let your lines of code breathe a little bit with some empty space. So it's okay even if you did this. In some cases, this may actually make it a little easier to read. So we're kind of spacing out our code a little bit. So if we keep it like this, and I say, all right, I want to do a conditional statement on this variable that I just defined, what I can do is say if, open parentheses, say my variable equals 0, and now space, and now boom, I'm opening a new code block. Now the if statement is starting a new code block, which means any line underneath it or any line within the code block itself should be indented. So if I hit enter here, our editor will go ahead and close that code block for us and put our cursor in that tabbed indented position within this new code block. So now I can go ahead and say, hey, if my variable is 0, let's do something. I'll say maybe let's draw a circle at x10, y10 with a radius of 10. Now you'll notice this is indented, and then any line of code that's underneath this, say maybe we want to make the fill here black, we could do that. So now this code is, you can kind of scan it with your eye and see exactly where code blocks start and end, right? So we can see the setup starts, then all of this code is within that setup code block, and then the if statement starts, and all of this code is within the if statement code block. So if we came outside of this function, the setup, we're now in a brand new code block. So we would not indent here because we're outside of any other code block. So if we wanted to say, hey, start a new code block, or let's write a new function draw, we're opening our code block, and now the next line is going to be indented. And now we can write our draw function. So maybe we want to give it a little space and say rectangle 10, 10, 10 by 10, and then we'll save it. And that's it. So that's kind of what I just wanted to highlight in this, is this idea of code blocks. And you can really think of a code block, if you're correlating it to regular literature, like a paragraph in itself. So it's a paragraph of text. And we want to isolate that paragraph of text by indenting it within the code block that we just opened up. And we can get pretty crazy with this. I mean, with larger pieces of code, you can see a lot of indentation going on because there's a lot of opening and closing of code blocks. And sometimes it can get really challenging when you're trying to keep track of which code block you're actually in. That's why it's even more important for us to keep track of this indentation. All right, guys? Thanks.